And I think those are most of the little housekeeping things. We do have a fabulous team in the background keeping track of the chat and any questions you might have. So please let us know if you come across any issues. And otherwise, I think I'll turn it over now to our wonderful moderator, Preeti DeLuca. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kani. Welcome, everyone. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, based on where you are based. I want to thank ERA, Asia Pacific, as well as Gender Trade Coalition for inviting me to moderate this wonderful webinar, which is very, very critical and relevant in today's time. Mobilizing for feminist trade justice within the United Nations. And it's always a pleasure to be amongst experts as well as feminists. So it's an honor to be here. Just quickly to set the context, trade and human rights discourse exposes the split personalities of our government. It is ironical that the same government that ratifies various human rights treaties out of their own free will also sign various free trade agreements to totally dismiss several of these same rights. It is as if the right hand doesn't know what the left is doing, and the left cannot be held accountable for what the right has signed. So this has been the dilemma with bringing human rights to trade accountability with our government. However, feminist scholarship as well as activism, especially from the global south, have drawn attention for decades through analysis and providing empirical evidence on the negative impacts of neoliberal economic policies rooted in capitalism, privatization, corporatization, trade liberalization, etc., that have systematically eroded human rights, especially women's human rights. And these efforts have had positive results, including increased awareness as well as resulting in gender policies, as well as various discourse around bringing gender analysis and human rights in trade agreements. Women organizations and movements historically. Of course, we are at 25 years of Beijing Platform for Action, and in these difficult times, it's really important also to remind ourselves how effective the women's movement was, is, and will continue to be, irrespective of all our challenges. We have done well to organize and strategically use various spaces, especially spaces within the UN, to hold states accountable to women's human rights obligations, and we cannot let go of our gains, but we have to strengthen and build up from here. However, these spaces have changed and present new challenges, opportunities, and limitations given current context, realities, and developments. And in today's webinar, we will visit some of these in more details with our panelists. Additionally, the current COVID-19 pandemic has also further exposed several issues that women have been raising for years. This includes the ad hoc social infrastructures, inadequate healthcare system, the devastating impacts of cuts in public spending, lack of universal social security protection, increased incidences of violence against women, alienation of women from their productive resources, including land and livelihoods, and under-recognition and undervalue of women's work, both paid as well as unpaid. Our governments, however, continue to be over-obsessed with economic growth at any cost, resulting in a lack of commitment towards human rights, gender equality, as we see it. Countries are opting for ease of doing business policies by diluting labor laws. India just did that, allowing exploitation of natural resources and degradation of environment in the name of growth and development. In such challenging times, how can we as feminists continue to build our collective strengths and strategically hold state accountable? Today's webinar will particularly explore what spaces, mechanisms, and tools the United Nations and the international human rights system provide as feminists and civil society in general to demand trade justice for all. Presenters will identify advocacy spaces and mechanisms within the UN, explore how globally accepted legal standards developed by international human rights mechanisms can be used effectively to hold states accountable. It is also important to take stock of the current challenge imposed by the global pandemic, and in these challenging times, what opportunity challenges do the UN spaces and mechanisms have for feminist trade justice work? I would We would do the webinar in two phases. So in the first phase, I have two presenters. And let me introduce our first presenter, Yokling Chi. Yokling is the director of Third World Network and a board member of ERA Asia Pacific. She has worked on a range of sustainable development issues from a Southern perspective and engaged actively within the UN system since early 1990s. In her presentation, Yokling will briefly unpack the challenges of current economic and trade policies and map the UN spaces, including the human rights bodies within these spaces. Yokling, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Priti, and good day to good evening to all who are with us tonight at this webinar. I'm really, really happy to be part of this discussion because the women's movement has been really one of the most organized, effective constituencies that has engaged very, very effectively at the UN level, across from treaty bodies to the New York General Assembly, pushing for norms, as well as being a watchdog and really providing a lot of intellectual inputs to shape policy thinking. So I think it's really appropriate that the gender and trade discussion and empowerment of women's rights is taking place really tonight. And this is one of many, many series, and I see really the intellectual and the mobilizing power of our women's organizations and movements across the world. I just want to really highlight a number of points. What COVID has done, and we all know this, we've talked about how it has laid bare, the deep inequalities that in 2015 at the UN, when the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted, it was not something new because we've been talking about paradigm shift, unsustainable production and consumption patterns since Rio 1992. And all the different conferences on building on rights framework has been extremely powerful, but the implementation has been abysmal. So while we have the UN that has come up with all the commitments, even binding treaties in law, political commitments at the highest level of declarations and programs of action, we find at the same time the real teeth and the real enforcement power was coming in the WTO, in the trade agreements, in the rights given to private, foreign investors to sue governments directly through investor-state dispute systems in the investment chapter of many of these trade and investment agreements. So we saw these the clash of the two paradigms. Yeah, what the UN was promoting: cooperation, solidarity, building capacity, recognizing that you don't punish, but you actually see the lack of capacity, the kind of catch up from colonial period for many of our countries. In that, the women have been even much more exploited and left behind. So we have to have equity, built in. So we have all that coming from the UN, but then we had the other side that was really undermining the solidarity model, the rights model, that really was pushing for privatization, for deregulation. And so when the COVID-19 exploded, what we see is that the few countries or a number of states like Kerala within India that managed to really respond to the public health crisis of an infectious disease were those that had really robust, functioning public health systems. And they were coordinated from the top to the bottom. And you can only have coordination and public confidence to survive lockdowns, to put up with a lot of the suffering if you trust your governance system. Right? So that comes really education, knowledge sharing, a society that believes that it can really mobilize to work together. I think this is really showing up. The countries before COVID, number one and number two in the World Bank, IMF, traditional criteria, who were the most well-prepared, best health systems in the world, were the United States and the United Kingdom. And where are they today? The world's most disorganized, fragmented, where people are suffering, really suffering. So we really are brought back to a reality check. And so the battles that we've all been fighting for in the women's movements have been at the forefront is we have to have public accountability, public systems, public financing, and we have to have everybody being involved in not just being inclusive, but really correcting the power imbalances. So what we find now is that at the time when multilateralism and the UN has to play a really big role, the fragmentation caused by neoliberal development of trade agreements and investment agreements and economic so-called partnerships in the last 20 years, the fragmentation we see at the national level has been reflected at the international level. So what do we see today? A UN that we are battling to save and to recapture. We have gone through 20 years, 25 years of partnerships with the private sector, solutions lie in the private sector, and that's not happening, right? And today, even trying to find vaccines, we think that 2 or 3 companies will save the world. It's not going to happen, right? So then we see the US, under the Trump administration, walking out of the WHO. And so who's the biggest financier of the WHO? A public international health organization is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. There's something fundamentally wrong when financing of the international public health organization is coming from a private foundation whose money came from monopoly of Microsoft, where open software was really being pressured to close down, and you have monopolies. So there's something really wrong, and we all know that. But this is the moment where we can say, where do we move forward? Now, the UN, some people are very cynical. They say, what's the point? It's not going to help us. But I think that those of us in this discussion tonight believe that the UN, we're not being romantic. We're saying that we have engaged in spaces, and we hear that tonight, and we know how those spaces work because we've gone in there. And I see, for example, look at UNCTAD. UNCTAD is very interesting. Within UNCTAD, you see the dilemma. One part of UNCTAD is very neoliberal. The other part of UNCTAD is really development-oriented, has come up with really good research, help policymakers in countries in the South, work with civil society groups to crunch numbers, to debunk the conventional modeling that says that if you join certain trade agreements, you're going to have so much more exports, your GDP will grow, and the assumptions are all wrong. The assumptions have nothing to do with reality, right? So that kind of collaboration, pick our allies in the UN system, WHO, UNCTAD, New York, the human rights mechanisms, and we find that there will be so much opportunity for us to work together to really not just save, but to reshape the multilateral system. And I personally believe very strongly it can be done. And it can be done, and we will have to bring that back to the member states. Right now, I do see that developing countries, the South, in terms of our political leadership, is very weak. We do not find that, who's out there? Is Macron talking? Is Trump saying stupid things, but he's making a lot of noise? Where is the leadership of the South? Today, I was very encouraged to see a statement coming up from South Africa in the World Trade Organization Council on Intellectual Property, where the fundamentals of the intellectual property system for the last 20 years is being questioned. So we lack that leadership, and we have to challenge our governments at the domestic level for that leadership to be voiced at the international level. So that's something that I think that we have to explore together and to work the spaces. And to do that, we have to really rally our research capacity, our analytical capacity, and we have to take every treaty, every commitment, and go into the details without losing the bigger picture of the political economy and the power relationships that is so unequal that we need to correct. And after me will be Vicky, who has really personally gone in there and worked the system. I think we can do that. The system has opened up doors, but we don't have power the way corporations have. We don't fly in a jet to go and see our prime minister, or when Bill Gates fly in his jet plane to Manila or to Kuala Lumpur or to Washington, he is greeted like a head of state, but he's unaccountable, right? And there are many others like him. So when you talk about the few individuals who are so rich in the world, when you see Google and Amazon and really controlling the new economy for the digital economy, we are not allowed to tax economic e-commerce transactions, which are in the trillions for the developing South. Where are we going to get the money to finance? The economic package, and I will end this, economic stimulus for many of our countries is about the same old thing. Let's sign more trade agreements because somehow it brings us foreign investment. Capital flight is moving so much out of our countries. The money has to come from us. We have to keep the money in our country. We have to recognize that farmers have an important role to play. Women farmers are feeding the world, and women are part of not a global supply chain. Women are part of reconstruction. The global supply chain was so disrupted by COVID, it was almost stopped in many cases. We have learned how we are so dependent on everything from masks to medicines to food. There's something wrong with that system. So let's reverse. It's not too late, and we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Oh, God. So sorry about that. It threw me out. Thanks so much, Yokley, for your very valuable comments and thoughts on that. Presenter, Victoria Charlie Corpus. Vicky is the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Director of TEP, the IPA, which is an Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education in Philippines. She has been involved in the work on trade and investment and how Indigenous peoples are impacted by this. Vicky, if you can talk about the role of UN special procedures, one of the mechanisms within the human rights mechanisms in the UN in addressing women and trade justice issues from your experience as a former special rapporteur. Vicky, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Preeti, and thank you very much to Iro and also the Asia Forum for helping organize this meeting. Well, as I just ended my term as the special rapporteur in 30th of April, and so I have been here I've been working as a rapporteur since 2004, and I know no, it's not 2004, it's later. But anyhow, I think the thing that the special procedures can contribute to this issue that Diokling has extensively discussed is really looking into the direct impacts of these trade agreements, investment agreements, and financial arrangements on the human rights of people, no, and so it's looking mainly. There's a working group that looks into the situation, the business sector, the business and human rights issues. This is composed of 5 people, and they are usually the ones who look into this issue and come up with a report every year to present what is the situation in relation to these transnational corporations and business enterprises. There's another independent expert on the issue of financial obligations and debt, of states, and how are these impacting on the rights, on the economic, social, and cultural rights. Of course, in relation to women, we have the special rapporteur on violence against women, its causes and consequences. And then there's a working group on discrimination against women in law and practice. This is composed of 5 people. So these are just few of the bodies that are directly looking into the situation of women, as well as the situation of foreign debt, trade, liberalization, among others. But all of us as rapporteurs, if we see that these issues are directly affecting the constituency that we are working with, then we do reports on this as well. So I did a report on the impact of financial agreements, bilateral financial agreements, and trade liberalization on indigenous peoples. And of course, that report also looked in particular at the situation of indigenous women, because, and as Yuklik has mentioned earlier, now with COVID-19, we can really see the role that women can contribute in addressing the crisis, the pandemic that we are facing, as well as the crisis in food security and the crisis in the public health system. In the end, the burden will fall on the women again. So there is really a lot of arguments that can be made to ensure that the women are given the possibility to contribute significantly in addressing this crisis. The thing is, of course, at best we can come up with reports, really go to the country level and look at what the situation is like, and that's the best part of the special procedure system. And particularly in my case, it allowed me to go to communities where indigenous peoples are directly affected by trade liberalization and financial agreements, and they themselves are very aware of it. And I think that's thanks to the civil society, to the women's groups, to indigenous peoples groups, the awareness about the direct effect of this on the human rights of peoples is really very much felt, and that the link is very direct. And so I think that's what we should be doing more and more. As Yokli has mentioned, we should be doing more research, monitoring of what's happening, especially in relation to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, which is becoming more and more distant for a lot of people. Reporting on this and making sure that the reports that are done, whether these are done by organizations or by rapporteurs, are really brought to the arenas where the decision makers are based, and this means at the national level as well as at the global and also at the regional levels. I think the more noise that is created in relation to how the situation of inequality, of increasing food insecurity, as well as the pandemic, has really to be made more visible, so that the policymakers will respond in the right way. So outside of monitoring, of course, is the continuing mobilization, no, of the civil society organizations to really make the UN more relevant. The UN, I mean, in itself, if it's just left to the member states, there will be a lot of gaps that you can see in terms of how they respond. The main reason why, in the end, they do a little response that's relevant is because of the civil society organizations that have been coming to the UN and presenting the reality on the ground. So that role has to continue. Of course, now it will be in a different form, because maybe most of this will be virtual. But that's the other challenge that we need to face. How do we make use of these technologies, considering the situation that we find ourselves in? And finally, of course, I think that the the paradigm that we have been fighting for since the beginning, since we all entered into this movement, is the paradigm. It's about time that this paradigm is going to be discussed more extensively. The academics are brought into the picture. Even the multilateral organizations have always been talking about a new world order, but you don't really see in the concrete what this is. So I think this is the time to really design and clearly describe what a new world order is that will address these problems that we are seeing right now. And I think that maybe just to go back, to end up with the COVID, the authoritarian approaches that are being taken to address COVID is certainly a very strong human rights issues. So we have to really go back to our leaders and tell them that it's not the militaristic or authoritarian approach that will work. It's really the looking at the issue as a public health issue, and not as an issue that has to be dealt with by the military or the authoritarian rulers. So I think that we have to also speak strongly about the loss of democracy using COVID-19 as a pretext. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Vicky. We will take some of the comments and questions. While we get organized, there was one very good comment from Priyanti, who highlighted about the non-aligned movement, where Yokling, you were raising the whole issue of where is the South leadership. I will tie to Priyanti's comment and also raise that, when BRICS came on the stage, we all were very optimistic that there would be this, South leadership challenging the hegemony of the West and provide a different kind of leadership, as well as space which is rooted in people's rights and engagement and participation. However, I can say we were greatly disappointed. It's business, same as usual, both in terms of the BRICS Bank as well as, of course, how the grouping is functioning too. So, Yokling, if you want to comment on what you're observing in terms of, South leadership. There was also some spark of South leadership in some trade agreements at WTO ministerial, but were they able to hold ground? Were they able to challenge? Were they able to create something which is sustainable? I think what Priyanti is alluding to.
Yeah, I think that, whether it's NAM or any kind of like-minded group of developing countries that will actually be able to play a more proactive role really depends on then coming back to the national level. Where do we have that leadership, right? So I think that it's not so much NAM, but really who are the leaders from NAM who's going to go in there. When I talk about leadership, it's not just the politicians. As much of it is actually about the civil servants, because that's where you have the continuity. And all of us as advocacy activists, we actually relate a lot to the civil servants because they're the ones who actually are working on policy and implementation. And politicians can come and go. Most of the time, they are a sort of steady force. So I think when we talk about government, we're talking about different levels. Also, the elected parliamentarians, right? And the judiciary as well, because a lot of things have to go to the court. So we need to have all those institutions protected. At the moment, I think the geopolitics are very turbulent, right? If you look at India and China, you look at how the Modi government, I won't even say, I shouldn't say India and China, how the Modi government sees itself as aligning with the Trump administration. And then you have the anti-China. I mean, China, I lived in China for more than 10 years. I worked there. And really, the more I learned, the more I actually realized how little I knew. Because these are complex continents, just as India. It's just such a thing called India, right? Even my little country, Malaysia, we are so different in different levels. And I think that's something that, so when we talk about South-South or like-mindedness, there is a challenge to the traditional non-aligned movement or G7, yeah. But I think we still have a lot in common, and we may be finding that commonness in the crisis. So in the end, I do not want to just rely on one or two political leaders. I think we need to really engage with the whole system within our countries, and then how that would reflect in the international level. But I do worry. I do worry that the geopolitics right now, what happens in Washington really shapes the world, because this November election is really driving Trump to do things which are so, we keep saying, oh my, it's so outrageous, right? But then he's not talking to you and me. He's talking to a certain base in the US, right? And so some people are even speculating that he might even trigger some kind of armed conflict. Is it going to be China in the South China Sea? It's going to be Iran? It's going to be somewhere in the Middle East? We don't know. But we have seen it happen in history, right? With other administrations before, Iraq War, for example. So we don't put that past them when they're desperate for their own domestic power. So I think that's... so as civil society, how do we engage? Not easy. I don't have solutions and answers, but we have to explore everything, and we have to really intensify our dialogue at all levels with those who are in the position to make decisions.
Thanks, Yoklin. One of the other comments, which I think, Vicky, you alluded in your presentation, was also that human rights language don't make it into these trade guidelines. And Ranja has raised a very important comment, and she says that in trade rules, in whether it's WTO, FTA, the language of human rights don't make it into this. So how do we resolve that? That's a real challenge, and that's what I was also in my introduction was saying, that it's the same government which does have human right obligation, but when it comes to trade agreements and its signing, it forgets its human right obligation and it's totally outside of that. So how do we bridge this very important gap?
Are you asking me that? I'm sorry,
Yeah, Vicky, if you can, if I may pose this question, comment to you.
Okay.
Or
yeah. The way to be.
You're not audible.
Right.
Vicky, you're not audible.
Yeah, connection is not good, I think.
Yeah.
I think it cannot be that governments are so putting a lot of priority to economic and social economic development, and then they totally forget their human rights obligations. At the end of the day, it makes the country unstable. It makes the world very conflictual, and I think they will lose a lot. So I think it's that the dialogue has to be constantly held to show them that by respecting the human rights obligations that they have, they are actually strengthening their own countries and the nation building that they are doing. You cannot really strengthen the nation if you have a situation where human rights obligations are always violated. So I think it's two things. first making these issues more visible, talking more about it, having campaigns to talk about these violations. But secondly, holding constant constructive dialogues with decision makers, because and of course the business sector as well, because they also have a big say on what's happening to the world. And I think that those are the two steps that need to be taken so that the UN will have a better balance in terms of dealing with both economic and social and cultural and human rights.
Thank you, Vicky. There are some very good comments in the chat. I will encourage the presenters to definitely look at that, and to after we finish the second session of presentations, maybe we can come and pick it up. I think there was another very important point made, that wonderful human rights language, but it doesn't get implemented. And so how do we address that? Let's move on to some of the teeth that we have in human rights, which are treaty bodies. We will focus the second session on looking at the human rights treaty bodies within the UN mechanisms, or the international human rights mechanisms. We have 9 treaty bodies, and the way treaty bodies, just to give you briefly overview of how treaty bodies work. The government states independently ratify the treaties, and once they sign and ratify, they are held accountable to the rights elaborated within the treaty, and they have an obligation to demonstrate how they are fulfilling the obligations, and they have to periodically report on the status of what is the status of those rights in their respective country. And this review is carried out by independent experts, which are committees of each treaty, and the committees also have a role of setting up norms and standards. And women's organizations have very effectively used this treaty body mechanisms, particularly CEDAW, as well as more recently even CESC, and have engaged with one other discourse which is happening within the UN around business and human rights. So let me invite our next set of presenters who will share their expertise on how these treaty bodies can play a role. So let me introduce Constanza Pauchulo, or Connie. Connie is a program officer at International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific, or ERA. She coordinates ERA's program on transforming economics and development through a feminist approach. For her presentation, I would request Connie to give a quick overview of CEDAW, and if you can share how CEDAW framework can be used as a tool to analyze trade policies and to develop recommendations to hold states accountable to the substantive equality standards. Connie, you have the floor. Connie, your audio. Connie, your audio. No. We can't hear you. Li Ting? Eating?
Hi, Connie. Do you want to try refreshing the page? And maybe the next speaker could go next.
Yeah, while you try that, let me introduce our next presenter while we figure that out. Kate Donnell is our next presenter. Kate is the director of program at Center for Economic and Social Rights. She's based in the US. She focuses primarily on how economic policy can be transformed to realize human rights and tackle inequality. Challenging, right? In her presentation today, Kate will focus on how CESC, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, one of the treaty bodies within the international human rights mechanisms, can be used as a vehicle for advocacy, and also share how CESC has engaged with macroeconomic issues.
Hi all. Thanks, Preeti. And yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we've lost Connie, but hopefully she'll be back and she can she can follow up from me. So I hope that it will kind of still make sense, me going first, because obviously CEDAW, what Connie was going to talk about is the kind of women's rights specific instrument. But, I do think it's important to note that, all the other international human rights treaties do also require states to implement them in a way which promotes substantive equality. So SASCA, I'll call it SASCA, which is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or SASCA, is, as the name would suggest, the covenant at the global level which protects economic, social and cultural rights. Just to give a kind of overview for those who aren't familiar, the kind of rights that it protects are, for example, the right to health, obviously very relevant in this moment, the right to decent work, the right to an adequate standard of living, which includes housing, food and water, for example, the right to social security or social protection. And it also, there's in the chapeau of SASCA is a non-discrimination clause. So all of these rights have to be implemented without discrimination on the basis of sex, race, and all the other usual grounds of prohibited discrimination under human rights law. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can use SASCA to deal with macroeconomic issues, especially trade. I will preface this by saying I'm very much not a trade expert, but I do have quite a lot of experience of working with SASCA on other macroeconomic issues. So hopefully what I have to say will be helpful. And also to say that one of my resolutions for this year is to learn more about trade. So I'm hoping to learn from all of this group in this webinar and in other spaces to become more of an expert on trade and especially its ramifications for women's rights over the next few months. So SASCA, as Preeti kind of already said, like the other treaty bodies, SASCA has kind of various ways which it works and that civil society can engage with it. So most importantly, and what I'll kind of focus on for now, is the reporting process, the country reporting process. But just to flag briefly that there are other kind of modes in which SASCA works, which is the production of general comments, which under CEDAW are called general recommendations, but they're essentially the same thing, which is kind of development of the norms, where the committee says, this is how we think these rights should be implemented, and these are their kind of full implications. And there are various general comments which are quite relevant to the issue of trade, which I'll talk about in a minute. There's also the optional protocol to CEDAW, which essentially means that people can bring cases to the committee. So individual cases of rights being violated can be brought to the committee, and that's quite a new function under SASCA, but that's important to know about too. And then there's the country reporting, which is, as Preeti said, where states come up for review, usually every 4 years, although that's in theory. In practice, there tends to be a longer kind of gap between each report. And during those reporting processes, civil society actually have a very important role to play in those reporting processes, in helping the committee formulate their questions to the country and then their recommendations to the country. And I'll talk a bit more at the end about how civil society have and can continue to influence the analysis and the recommendations that SASCA and other treaty bodies make to countries. So just to say something very briefly about the general comments first, because I think it's important to understand in terms of understanding the scope with which SASCA, the committee, see their work. So there's many general comments. There's 25 now, but I just wanted to zoom in very quickly on two recently, mostly just to kind of flag their existence to you, because I don't have time to do a kind of full analysis of them. But there's two recently which are very relevant. There's General Comment 23 on work from 2016, which kind of which reinterprets the standards on work, on the rights to work and rights at work under SASCA, and it talks specifically about trade agreements and says that states should ensure that trade agreements and other similar agreements don't infringe on people's right to work. There's also General Comment 24, which focuses on business, like states' obligations in terms of kind of regulating business and preventing violations of rights by business. And that one's definitely worth a look, because there's a lot of content actually on trade and how trade agreements could potentially infringe on the rights in the covenant. So it talks about how states should identify conflict between their obligations under the covenant and under trade or investment treaties, and indeed even refrain from entering into those treaties where there are conflicts. So those, if you're kind of interested in engaging with SASCA, those general comments are definitely worth looking at to help you see how the committee understands and interprets their role and how you might be able to bring in those issues. So now I'm going to focus, for the rest of my couple of minutes, I'm going to focus on the country reporting process, because I do think that civil society submitting shadow reports has been a really important way of influencing the normative development of human rights in general and of influencing human rights focused recommendations to governments. So a quick shout out to a really useful tool, which is the Universal Human Rights Index. I will paste a link to it in the box when I'm done speaking. But it's an index where you can basically search different international human rights instruments. It's run by OHCHR. So you can choose treaty bodies, you can choose a particular treaty body, you can choose special rapporteurs, you can choose which instrument you want to look at, and then you can search for specific terms. So for example, if you type trade agreements into the box and you choose treaty bodies, you'll be able to find kind of all the different things that different treaty bodies have said about trade agreements. So that's a really useful tool, I think. And if you do that, you'll find that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights has made a number of recommendations to countries about trade agreements and kind of warning them about how particular trade agreements or investment agreements are jeopardizing people's rights. So, for example, and I would say as well that there's been a real uptick of this in recent years. I think increasingly the committee, like other committees like CEDAW as well, have started taking on these macroeconomic issues much more. So now is a really right time for this kind of advocacy. So, for example, in the last few years, I mean, I did a quick search of the index, and there's been recommendations about trade to Tunisia, to Germany, to Switzerland, for example, and there were several more as well. Yeah, so I'll leave it there on that, because you can do your own searching for your country and see if those things have come up. But also, it's important to say that the committee is also engaged on other macroeconomic issues like tax, for example, which is the area that I focus most on in my advocacy, is looking at how like domestic tax policy and how global tax rules have kind of infringed on people's rights and prompting and trying to influence the committee to give strong recommendations on those issues, which they increasingly have, for example, on Switzerland and the UK. And it's important to say, in terms of the norms that you can use for prompting the committee to make these recommendations, I think there are two really important norms to flag under SASCA, or standards to flag under SASCA, that aren't there in quite the same way in other covenants. So there's the obligation for states to devote maximum available resources. It's jargon, but hopefully I'll explain a little bit what it means, to the realization of the rights in the covenant, which basically means that states, it's not enough for states to say there's no money to implement the right to social security, or there's no money to implement the right to health. That has to be interrogated, and you have to analyse whether they are devoting the maximum available resources to those rights. And one of the resources that Connie shared beforehand helps to explain a little bit more how that obligation works. I'll post another link to it in the box. But essentially it means that in order to interrogate whether those resources are being allocated to human rights instead of, say, like military spending, we need to look at like how big the pie is, to use the kind of classic pie metaphor. We need to look at how big the pie is. So is the state raising enough money in the first place to adequately fund those rights? How is the pie being divided? So is it kind of most of it going to military spending? Is half of it being thrown away on wasteful tax incentives? And who's then eating it in the end? Like, who's benefiting from that spending? So those are the important things to analyse. And so, for example, if you as a civil society organisation can prove, well, actually, this trade agreement that my government has signed is kind of essentially kind of throwing away a bunch of resources that could otherwise be spent on rights, that will be a very persuasive argument for the committee under the maximum available resources clause. And also, I'm sure I have to wrap up soon. I'm sure I'm running out, but I will just say a couple more things. Also, it's important to note that the obligations of the covenant, like most international human rights conventions, do apply across borders. So this is called extraterritorial obligations. So, for example, this ETOs have been used to to give recommendations to, for example, Switzerland and the UK, saying, well, their like tax or financial secrecy regimes are harming countries abroad. So this tool of the ETOs can be used to kind of criticize global North countries, especially, and saying that their actions are actually infringing on the rights of people in other countries in the global South, for example, by enforcing unfair trade agreements. So I'll just wrap up with a few tips, which I can kind of expand more on in questions and in the chat if it's helpful. But just a few tips, and I'll paste this list into the box as well. The few tips that I've found really important for engaging effectively with CESCA, and this probably applies to other treaty bodies as well, is so number one, identify champions within the committee. Like you want to find the committee members who might be most in favour of your issues. Get your list on the list of issues. So that there's before the committee write the report, several months before they do an initial report with questions to the country, and you want to get your issue on there. It's important to ally with other organisations. There's strength in numbers within civil society. Make sure you relate your issue directly to the covenant rights. So don't just say, oh, this trade agreement is a problem. Make sure you're relating it directly to rights under the covenant and showing the impact. Be very specific about what recommendations you'd like to see. It's helpful to give the committee language that they can use. Break down dense or very technical information. So, for example, don't assume a high level of expertise in trade from the committee members, because that may not exist. If you can, provide statistics and visualize the impacts, because that makes it easier for the committee to use, and also use the media to exert pressure on your country and to raise attention. And I think the final point, which I think is really crucial, is to follow up, because as I'm sure other people will raise, one of the weaknesses of the treaty body regime is that there's not a kind of official follow-up mechanism. So it's really I'm wrapping up, I promise this is my last sentence. It's really like the onus is on civil society to follow up and use that pressure and use their advocacy tools to really ensure that the treaty body, that the governments implement the recommendations. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Kate. You have given a whole range of, the whole treaty tools. Without wasting any time, let me see if Khani, are you ready? If your mic is working now, if you want to pick up and go next. Khani? Is Khani there? Khani, are you there? Can you go next?
I am here. Hello?
Yeah, great. We can hear you.
Okay.
Please go ahead. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So sorry about that. And thank you, Kate, for jumping in like that. That was a really helpful presentation and very informative. And I hope I'll be able to follow it up along with all the other rich discussions that have already been happening in the chat box and in the other presentations. So I'm just going to, quickly set up this presentation. And what I'm planning to do is focus on linking the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW for short, to feminist trade justice demands. And the idea here is not necessarily to think of CEDAW as a all-around solution or panacea for the gender trade issues that feminists have been bringing up for decades, but as a tool that can support broader advocacy issues. And I'm just going to ask Yiting if she has access to the presentation, because I can't switch the slides from my end, or if she can give me access, and then I'll keep chatting away. There we go. Thank you so much. So diving right in, CEDAW has been described as an international Bill of Rights for women. It defines what constitutes discrimination against women and sets out what states must do in order to eliminate discrimination in all its forms. And through advocacy by feminists, women's rights organizations, and the work of the CEDAW committee, significant space has been created for a focus on the rights of marginalized groups of women and the requirement that an intersectional approach be used when interpreting and reviewing state obligations, which of course means addressing how women may be multiply burdened by intersecting forms of oppression that include class, race, age, ability, and other historical and social factors. Broadly speaking, the convention is based on 3 principles, which together we refer to as the CEDAW framework. And these principles are state obligation, non-discrimination, and substantive equality. When thinking about trade or economic policy, I find the concepts of non-discrimination and substantive equality particularly helpful. One, because the principle of non-discrimination means that we have to not only look at how the policy is designed, but what its effect or outcome is. So if trade policy leads to privatization of public services, on paper, there may not be express discrimination against women, but we know that the impact of that privatization disproportionately burdens women and undermines the enjoyment of their human rights. Second, similarly, in terms of the principle of substantive equality, it requires that we look beyond what's written in laws and policies and see what's happening in practice, how measures to promote equality are affecting women on the ground, especially those from marginalized or disadvantaged groups. So, applying this very quick summary of the convention to trade policy, we would say that at a minimum, trade policy should not, reinforce existing inequality, fail to deliver benefits to disadvantaged or marginalized groups of women, or result in reversal of enjoyments of rights, such as deregulation of labor protections that may have existed before the policy or agreement went into place. Unfortunately, as we can see in this brilliant article recently published by our friends in the Gender and Trade Coalition, which I'll add a link to because I very much recommend everyone to give it a read. The current economic and trade models does not live up to these standards. This model, including trade and investment regimes, is not only wholly enmeshed in patriarchal standards and discriminatory norms and stereotypes, it relies on them. So, for example, as explained in the article, the system relies on the devaluation of women's labor, including unpaid care work, to maintain the falsehood that unrestrained economic competitiveness and growth is good for everyone and the best way of organizing our economies, some of which Preeti already set out for us at the beginning. And this is important because this drive to gain a competitive advantage affects everything from labor and environmental standards, policy around taxing and regulating corporations, what public money is spent on, and so on, which all has deep gendered impacts. And I think this addresses, Deanna being one of the authors, and I saw a really good comment from her in the public chat about the difference between human rights as potentially a band-aid or short-term solution and reimagining an entire new trade and economic system based on feminist principles of justice and decolonialism and redistribution of wealth and reparations and similar types of principles, equality, of course. So this article really goes a long way in setting that out and is an important thing to consider when strategizing around when and where and how to mobilize these tools in support of broader advocacy goals and strategies. So what I've done here is just list a few of the kinds of issues that are often raised by trade justice and economic justice advocates, all of which have specific gender impacts and have been addressed by the CEDAW committee or feminists and women's rights organizations engaged in CEDAW advocacy. If not specifically in the context of trade, then in other related areas that might be helpful in framing trade justice analysis and demands in relation to international human rights standards. And the first example I have here is actually from Germany's review in 2017, and it's a report submitted by its National Human Rights Institution, which included a section on extraterritorial obligations, or ETOs, which of course is the obligation to protect human rights outside the country's national borders. And specifically linked issues of land grabbing in the textile sector in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to German corporations, its financial sector, and German and European development policy. The committee took up this issue in its concluding observations, which is the outcome document at the end of the state review process, and highlighted the primacy of Germany's international human rights obligations over the interests of investors, and the need to ensure that investor-state dispute settlement procedures, which are hugely problematic in terms of undermining human rights, don't create obstacles for compliance with the convention. So this starts to give us a sense, and particularly because this observation was made in the context of trade and investment agreements that were being negotiated, it gives us a sense of how the convention can be applied to trade policy and trade negotiations. The next example is another very helpful shadow report from earlier this year in February 2020 for Pakistan's review, which dealt with the role of global economic actors and institutions in encroaching on national policy space, looking specifically at the impact of IMF loan conditionalities on Pakistan's social spending and tax policy, and the adverse impact on women's human rights. And we're lucky to have Bill Quees in the audience, who drafted this portion of the shadow report for Shirkat Partnership for Development. So I'm sure she can jump in with her own comments on the process. But I wanted to emphasize very quickly the part that was quoted in the report from the CEDAW preamble, which I think is worth reading in full. It says, quote, emphasizing that the eradication of apartheid, all forms of racism, racial discrimination, colonialism, neo-colonialism, aggression, foreign occupation and domination, and interference in the international affairs of states is essential to the full enjoyment of the rights of men and women, end quote. And I think this is something that's worth kind of banging on about, especially given that the preamble is an important and authoritative tool for interpreting the purpose and scope of the specific obligations of the convention. And of course, interference in internal affairs is quite important for analyzing and crafting demands relating to our unequal globalized economic and trade system. And then the next one I'll go through super quickly. It's another very helpful shadow report that looked at the impact of cross-border tax policy on the ability of other state parties, especially those with limited means, to mobilize resources necessary to fulfill women's human rights. So again, looking at extraterritorial obligations, and I think the analysis in this shadow report and in the concluding observations is particularly important for thinking about, unequal power dynamics between states, how that's reflected and reinforced by the current global economic model, and how human rights-based advocacy can be used as one tool for challenging that. And then I think I'll end on the next slide. I'm trying to keep an eye on Preeti to see if I'm running out of time. But just to say that I've kind of listed a few areas here where the CEDAW committee has commented on issues related to trade justice that may be helpful in making those links between trade justice advocacy and CEDAW. And I'm happy to share these slides after the session. And I just want to close very quickly by acknowledging that there is, some uncertainty around how state review processes at the UN will move forward in light of the pandemic. But what I'm hoping that folks will take away from this presentation is that the analysis and links to CEDAW obligations is not limited to the international level. It can be used at all levels of political advocacy to make links between feminist trade justice demands and legally binding commitments made by states. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Khani. And I know I really appreciated you coming second, though you built up from where Kate left, but I can see how the two presentations were complementary. We are going to shift a little bit of gear and go to Alejandra, who is going to take us into one of the really great advocacy efforts that feminists are leading within the UN to demand for a binding treaty on business and human rights. Just to give you a quick introduction about Alejandra Scampini. Alejandra is a Uruguayan feminist who has been active in social movements for more than 20 years. She joined PODER in 2018 as Senior Advocacy Associate and has been involved in promoting business and human rights regional movement with several allies. Alejandra is particularly going to talk about the entire advocacy efforts from a feminist and women's rights group in pushing for a legally binding instrument within the UN human rights system on business and human rights. Alejandra, you have the floor.
Oh, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. So first of all, let me thank you for this invitation. I want to thank the organizers, the Gender and Trade campaign, and the Women's Rights Act, also of Asia Pacific, for this invitation to PODER. For those who don't know us, PODER is a regional non-profit organization working to improve the corporate transparency and also the accountability in Latin America from a human perspective, and to strengthening also the civil society stakeholders of civil society action, of corporations, as long as, in terms of accountability warrants. And because of this work that we do, we are also part of different movements. One is the Plataforma América Latina Mejor Sin TLC. It's a free trade, it's anti-free trade agreement, Latin American coalition. And we are also part of, the Feminist for Binding Treaty. We are proudly co-founders of that Feminist for Binding Treaty. We are members of the Treaty Alliance. So my reflections today are part of this, work that we have been doing for more than 5 years today with these members of the different alliances and platforms for action. And when I was preparing for this presentation today, which is what the issue of trade and gender convene us, I was reading at the news, and I'm sure you also know that recently the agreement of the US, Mexico, and Canada Free Trade Agreement came into force, which, I'm not an expert on trade, as Kate was saying, but definitely this trade agreement is more about the protection and the reinforcement of the economy of the US, and not so much about creating a regional, bloc for trade in the region. Also, it's not an agreement that it's just about liberalization of trade, but also about, creating more asymmetries and inequalities between among these countries. And also, more importantly, and this is an issue that is also important for us feminists, is migration. How can you think about a free trade agreement today in our region where the migration issue has been left out and is so important for us today? And this is just one example. Some days before that agreement was signed, we have the ratification also of Brazil and Chile Free Trade Agreement. We have Uruguay and Chile Free Trade Agreement. And this is moving away from the idea of a regional, free trade or, trade agreement. It's not free, trade agreement in the region. And also giving more strength to corporations and not to states. Also importantly in this context, in this picture, in this scenario, is to bring the issue of the international centers for settlement investment disputes and all the claims that big corporations are making on states. And very recently, the movement in Chile, the civil society movements in Chile are denouncing how, a company is suing Chile government on, millions of dollars. So why am I putting this into context, because I think that we need to bring back all our lessons, all our analysis from the feminist and women's rights movements from the 90s, when we were in Seattle, when we were very at the origins even of the UN gender architecture. So I think that we need to recap from that analysis and see how we can get more involved in this new, very complex scenario that is reinforced even more by the declarations of World Bank, G20, even ECLAC, that is saying that this COVID, this crisis, can only be solved if we look at trade and we liberalize economy. So the scenario today, what it's telling us is that we have a series of proposals on public policies that are oriented to keep trade open and functioning, while on the other side we have a heavy health crisis, humanitarian crisis, care crisis, financial crisis, and climate crisis. But I think that also there is not just these trade agreements, but an overall global consensus that trade is the key. The free trade is a key for the recovery plans. And this is fundamental for us to keep in our analysis and debates, and how we can be part of this. When we think about this overall context and we think about trade, we cannot just see it as in a silo. You know, human rights are also impacted by trade agreements, as trade agreements impact human rights. And this has been like the mantra for us, also entering in this space of creating a movement of ensuring corporate accountability. So for me, the call today in this webinar is to look at not just the issue of trade and gender or environmental justice or economic justice, but to look at the overall movements that we can be part of the ensuring corporate accountability. So when Yoko was saying where is the leadership in the South, I think there is an opportunity there. And the opportunity, I think, started some time ago in this historic opportunity of the legally binding treaty that was launched in 2014 by Ecuador and South Africa. Of course, very different context right now, but that is a movement that started growing in 2014, not just from the civil society that has been sufficient evidence of the need and to fill in the gap on how we can really keep transnational corporations accountable from violations of women's rights. This movement that started in 2014 is today at another stage. We are still awaiting for a draft of this legally binding instrument. And feminists have engaged in this process because we believe that we need to go beyond the business case, something that I think some of you mentioned, how human rights can enter into this space. Well, they have entered the space, but from a language of business, of profits. So you can read a lot about women, you can read about development, you can read about micro enterprises, microcredit, but from a point of view of profits. So this is why we are entering in this space of the binding treaty, in order to create a global movement towards more corporate accountability and really take it as part of the recommendations to recover from COVID. I think that one thing that we can really appreciate from COVID is that it has exposed all forms of injustices and violence and gender inequalities, and there are more open ears to that. We cannot forget that more and more people are affected, not just, we are analyzing or we are participating in UN debates. There are more and more people affected who are also part of this movement, and we need to engage them. So that's the one thing. As early as COVID exploded in the 2020, we exposed and we gave a lot of evidence on why we need a systemic change of the current macroeconomic model. And I think you have mentioned also that we need to use this opportunity to call for systemic change, and the binding treaty should be part of the systemic change. Another thing that we need to look at an opportunity is the issue of workers' rights. workers' rights before profit in recovery measures. And I think that the ILO conventions, the ILO recommendations, the ILO treaties have to be interlinked into our work of the women's rights. This is not a space that we usually see, women's rights movements. I mean, there have been advancements on the movement towards violence in the workspace, but we need to engage more. Another issue that is another entry point is call for attacks to big corporates and prioritize funding for nationalized healthcare system. I think that from Mexico to Bolivia, all what we are seeing is that the weakening in our region of the healthcare system and underfunded. I think that movements need to be part of, the women's movement need to be part of that. Thirdly, we need to be part of the Stop Corporate Influence on Government Policy and Decision Making. We still need more women's presence in those debates and in due diligence debates, so that it becomes, that we dispute what is the big new normal in that space. Then, and this is my final message, we need to challenge corporate capture, impunity, and power. The scale of corporate abuses that we are evidencing, that we are documenting, violations in the wake of COVID have revealed again the urgency of confronting the corporate capture, the impunity, and the power. So the path for us in Poder and the Feminists for Binding Treaty, and I hope this enlightens the leadership in the South, is corporate accountability, human rights, and environmental justice at the center of the COVID-19. The Feminists for Binding Treaty is awaiting the new draft. We are a space that is open, and we hope that this can be an umbrella where environmental, gender justice, and workers' rights can, become as a platform for action to all of us. Sorry for my long intervention.
No, it was just fine. Thank you so much, Alejandra. There are some very good comments on this. I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the comments, questions that are being shared in the chat, and then invite our three panelists to share their thoughts on it, and then again bring the first panelist to have quick closing remarks before we close the webinar. So one of the things that people shared was that, okay, you use the treaty body reporting mechanisms and you get great concluding recommendations from the committee, but how do you bring pressure, and it could be ad hoc cases in one particular country, but how do you bring sustainable change that becomes a norm? That has been shared in terms of the challenge in using treaty body in particularly addressing some of the things. I think Kate and many, I think even Ira, Khani, we also in PUSER have used treaty body with various shadow reports effectively, but then how do you bring using that mechanism to bring sustainable change? I'm going to just raise few, and then the panelists can pick and comment on that. That was an interesting point. Second is what I think all of them talked about. So what is the way forward? I think we see a lot of challenge. We see the mechanisms are there, going back to even what Vicky had said, that how do you really implement? And going back to the points with Alejandra raised in environment, where in many of our countries, where you start raising these questions, you immediately are seen as anti-national, and you're labeled as anti-development, and you face all kinds of threats, and in many cases it can be very, very critical as human rights defenders, the challenges that we face. In all of this, not to have a pessimistic, but how do we strategize to find our USB in using these tools, mechanisms that exist within the human rights, particularly treaty bodies, to bring pressure on governments and corporates effectively, that it results not just in one or two cases, but in a sustainable change. So if I can invite our panelists, anyone who wants to jump in to comment, or you can pick on any other comments that have been raised in the public chat if you want to respond to any questions or comments in there. Yeah, Kani, go for it.
Yes, great. I'm glad to see that Kate's joining too.
Yeah, Kate is joining too, and I hope Alejandra is there too. I hope. Yeah. Please go ahead, Kani. You can get us started.
Sure. I'll just be very quick in terms of what to do after the review processes. I think one is, as I mentioned at the end of my presentation, is to think about these international norms and standards not as isolated within the UN level procedures, but as potentially useful tools, strategic tools tied to legally binding commitments that can be used at all levels of political advocacy, at the national level, at the regional level. So what it really, I think, comes down to in terms of follow-up and implementation is what Alejandra mentioned in terms of supporting movements and building alliances across different movements, and being strategic in terms of which entry points will be the most effective in pushing forward a particular demand within the broader umbrella of a broader vision of a transformed alternative economic order. So I'm not sure if that's very concrete or helpful. I'll borrow from Yokling to say that I don't really have easy answers, but I do agree with Alejandra that it really lies in supporting the movements and building alliances and breaking down silos and trying to take on the systemic structural approach, and using the concluding observations or other outcomes as advocacy tools where it seems most effective, strategically effective. So with the civil servants that Yokling mentioned at the beginning, with other government spaces, with other accountability bodies, whatever it might be that works for your strategic advocacy goals.
Thanks, Connie. Kate, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think this question of follow-up is really critical, and it's really hard to kind of maintain the momentum and the energy, and to keep pressuring the government when there are so many other priorities. But there have been various examples of it being done effectively, and some of those have been shared in the box here. And I think so. One example is I pasted an example of South Africa in the box, which you can all look at. But I think another example is Spain, for example, when the committee, kind of starting in 2008, kind of regularly criticised Spain's austerity policies, like post-financial crisis austerity policies. And especially a change to the healthcare provision, which basically excluded undocumented migrants from the universal in scare quotes healthcare system. And eventually, when the new government came in a couple of years ago, they revoked that exemption and cited the CESCA recommendation as part of their reason for doing so. So there are some success stories, and that was a result of civil society keeping up the pressure, keeping telling the government that this was part of their human rights obligations and they had to do something. Another thing which I think is relevant to several of the questions raised is I do think that there's more potential for global South governments to be using the critical recommendations that have been raised against global North governments around their extraterritorial obligations. And we see very little of this so far, actually. And of course, there's issues of power dynamics, and that's why we see very little of this. But I do think that could potentially be a powerful tool. If a global South government is able to say when they're negotiating something, look, the human rights treaty bodies have said that this kind of agreement is contrary to your extraterritorial human rights obligations. Maybe that could help, but I'm very aware of the geopolitics and political economy of that. So.
Thanks, Kate. Alejandra, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, please go ahead, Alejandra.
So I think that reiterating my last message and also thanking again for these great conversations, because what I see in the chat, all the dynamic, all the agreeing to disagreeing and the different comments, it's really inspiring also the kind of energy we need in this moment. And I think that I reiterate this call to be part of this global movement to to rethink multilateralism, to challenge the systemic, to really propose a new form of organizing economically, but also for women's rights organizations who are hearing us today, is you need to be more engaged in this issue of business and human rights. We need to be more involved, closer to communities, closer to human rights defenders, use this opportunity where workers' rights are also affected to work together. We need to create more conscious. We have lots of new evidence to really, show why we need to make the case for this. This is an opportunity to document what's going on and also talk to other sectors like investors, business people. And I know that I might not be very popular saying this, but some of us are still in the comfort zone, still talking to allies, still talking to each other. We need to disrupt in these debates. We need to dispute how they are using our human rights framework. And we need to show evidence to people that might not be in our usual debate. So I think that just to say that these times are compelling us to work together, and I hope I see you in the Feminist for Binding Treaty movement.
Thanks, Alejandra. I would invite Vicky as well as Yokley if you want to make a comment on anything that has been shared, or you want to raise any questions which the second session panelists have raised.
Well,
Yokley and Vicky. Yokley,
maybe just for me to agree with the points being raised by our friends who have been following the treaty bodies. I think that these times really call for us to review all the international human rights norms that have been agreed upon by most states and signed on to, and really see how concretely this can be used to address the issues of the most oppressed and the most marginalized. And in this time of COVID, we can exactly see what the situation is like for the ones who are, that the racism and the discrimination has reared its ugly head in a very significant way. And there's nothing that the only response that we can do to address this is to really go back to the norms and make sure that the duty holders of these norms are really going to comply with these norms. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. Yokley.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a really rich, not just rich, but just the fact that, just this small group around tonight's discussion is just bringing so much real experience and thinking and critique and honesty. And just the sharing, many of us don't really know each other yet. We know of each other's work in our organizations. I think that's really a very powerful characteristic of the women's movement, which is very, very unusual. You don't find it in other places. And I think that really moving forward, how do we actually organize ourselves? I always feel that, if we don't get more achieved, it's because we haven't organized ourselves. Recognizing that so-called the other side has got more resources, more money, more influence, easy access to the political power, but we have something that they don't have. We are everywhere. And I think that I was just talking to Diana offline that really, if you're a physicist, it's about the chaos theory. Energy and dynamism is always on the edge of order. Because when you reach order, you reach equilibrium, and then it's boring, because then life changes all the time. And I think that's really what is the strength of the women's movement. So I would say that we need to think, how do we pull together the different human rights forum and the norms. The norms are there. We don't lack the norms. What is happening is that the enforceable rules in the trade and economic and finance arena, that's the thing that's actually undermining the human rights norms, because the way we want to implement human rights is very different from the way they punish with trade sanctions. Yeah. And the other really, we haven't had time to discuss this. It came out in the text discussion a little bit, but really is we are not so well informed, let alone engaging, and how to engage is to be able to think through that with the financial institutions, right? The banks, the reinsurance schemes, that whole area of finance. And there are lots of women and other organizations working on that too. We need to bring that in. The Financing for Development work within the UN has got some really amazing people doing fantastic work. And I think we need to bring that in. I think Julia was it Julia who talked about what do local groups do? And I think in all the issues that we worked in, whether it's farmers and land rights and indigenous peoples and their fighting mining companies, that connection has always been there from the local to the global. But we need to do more of that. And I was just working with quite a lot of groups working with women farmers and farming communities. We were thinking, how do we use CEDAW? How do we use CEDAW to implement our rights as farmers, as small farmers, food security? So we need to do that cross-fertilization, and I think that's really really exciting, and we have no choice. We have to do it. Let's think about how to do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Yo Kling. I know I had this task of closing. I will not get into summarizing such a rich discussion, but I have to say, I think we all were feeling fatigued and challenged, and within, of course, the work we do in human rights, on women's rights, and then the additional challenge of the pandemic. But I have to say today's webinar has inspired and has sparked some ideas and has definitely brought out a collective spirit of how we move forward, and have shown some great spark and some possibilities. And I really hope that we come together on that and figure out one or two strategic things that we can do which will have maximum impact, which brings in our collective expertise, and we zero in on which will really bring the pressure that we are talking about, right from whether local, national, or global. And I think the panelists have already shared, we have the analysis, we have the tools, we have the expertise, we are everywhere. We know how to network, we know how to organize. We just have to put it together and bring it together. So with that, I want to thank all the panelists as well as our participants with the rich conversation that is going on in the chat. I hope we capture that and we continue this. And thanks very much, and thanks Shanti as well as Eating for the backhand support that you have been giving, and the entire ERA Asia Pacific team. And wonderful. I am inspired, so I really want to thank you all. Connie, did you want to add something?
I just wanted to jump in with a thank you and a plug to the Gender and Trade Coalition. I had intended to do that at the beginning, but kind of missed out in the housekeeping. So thank you so much. If you are all interested, you can Google Gender and Trade Coalition. I think it was also included in the public chat to see the type of work that they do. See if you'd like to join. It's a really fantastic group of organizations doing the type of rich thinking and mobilizing that you're seeing in the chat today. So thank you to everyone involved in that.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.
Good night. Some people are starting their day. All right. How do we close this?
Thank you.